Good evening, everyone. We're in Atlanta. You have to respond. Good evening, everyone. Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here this evening. Perfect weather, beautiful Atlanta day for just a really wonderful Atlanta story. So we're just so grateful that you're able to join us. My name is Claire Haley. I'm Vice President of Public Relations and Programs here for Atlanta History Center. I get to do a lot of fun things in my job, but probably one of my most favorite parts of my job are these author events. Getting to meet readers, getting to meet amazing authors. So thank you so much for being here and sharing that with us tonight. Tonight's especially special for us at the History Center because the building that you're in right now is McElreath Hall. It's where we have our Keenan Research Center. And some of the research done for this event that Ronnie did for this event, he did in this building. So it's a little bit of a homecoming of sorts. During the pandemic, Ronnie made a trip down here in August of 2020. So a very weird time to be doing that, to do extensive research in our archives here. So we're just so grateful that he's able to come back and share the end results with us tonight. So again, tonight's author is Ronnie Greene. His book is Heart of Atlanta, 5 Black Pastors in the Supreme Court Victory for Integration. I saw many of you had pre-purchased your books, but if you'd like to buy another one for a friend, or if you haven't bought yours yet, you can do that after the event. They are 25% off this evening, and Ronnie will be signing and personalizing books after the event, so make sure to stick around for that. That'll just be right out in the lobby where you came in. I don't think, given talking to many of you as you came in, that Ronnie needs much introduction, but let me just briefly introduce him, and then we'll welcome him out here this evening. Ronnie Greene is an investigative journalist. He edits in-depth stories for Reuters and teaches writing at Johns Hopkins University. He's the author of several books besides Heart of Atlanta, including Shots on the Bridge, Police Violence and Cover-Up in the Wake of Katrina, which was published in 2015 and awarded the Investigative Reporters and Editors Book Award. His journalism is also award-winning on multiple fronts. He is honored with an Emmy Award, the Harvard Goldsmith Prize for Investigative Reporting, and the IRE Medal. He's also a Pulitzer Prize winner for his book, or for his journalism project at the Nonprofit Center for Public Integrity in 2014. So please join me in welcoming tonight's author, Ronnie Greene.
Thank you so much. And thanks also, of course, to Claire and to the History Center. It is unique and interesting to be speaking at a book event at one of the places where you had done research. So I thank Claire for all of her work in setting up this talk. And she's not here, but thank Leah Lefkowitz, who is a researcher at the History Center who helped, during COVID, helped get me into the building when I could and helped open up 14 boxes of archives for me, which were really helpful. So I'm really enthused to talk about this story because I think it's a deeply consequential story that perhaps outside of Atlanta, most people really don't know about. I know when I was researching this book over the course of 3 or 4 years, and we live outside D.C., we'd be talking to friends, fellow journalists, and I got blank stares every time I mentioned this case, every time I mentioned this story. Again, maybe not in Atlanta, so I make that clear. But otherwise, and I feel like it's such a consequential story that I was delighted to bring to the page. So I'm going to read a couple of very brief passages as I go and also really just talk about some of the issues that were in the book. And I'll begin by sort of setting the frame for the book. The frame for Heart of Atlanta, 5 Black Pastors in the Supreme Court Victory for Integration is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And that was the most momentous civil rights legislation in the country in 100 years. It was introduced by John Kennedy in June of 1963 at a time of racial strife, racial riots, racial killings, KKK in power in many southern cities. And the Civil Rights Act of 64 had 11 main components, and my book really focuses on Title II, one of those 11 titles. Title II dealt with public accommodations, restaurants, hotels, motels, movie houses. Now, before the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, if a local motel owner, local restaurant owner didn't like the color of the skin of a potential customer, he or she could just kick them out. And what would happen back in those cases in the early 60s is that oftentimes the potential customer who was trying to get a seat at a restaurant, trying to get a bed in a hotel room, the customer would be arrested for trespassing, for violating segregation edicts, and for disturbing the peace. The world was certainly upside down. So the Civil Rights Act's Title II, Public Accommodation, said, if you're a private business, but you sort of serve the public, if you're a restaurant or a motel and you take customers in from across state lines, you can no longer decide your clientele based on race. As President Kennedy said when he unveiled his proposal, this is just an indignity that people are denied access to these places based on race. So that sort of set the world straight, and it said if you're one of these private business people, you can't turn people away based on the color of their skin. So what I really found fascinating was that the first two legal challenges over the Civil Rights Act of '64 were both in Atlanta. The first one was literally filed the same day Lyndon Johnson signed the act, July 2, 1964. That same day, a motel proprietor named Morton Rolliston, who was an Emory-trained lawyer who ran the Heart of Atlanta Motel, he had taken deep umbrage to the government telling him who he could serve. He felt like that was his private liberty was being taken away. So on the night that Lyndon Johnson signed the law, Morton Rolliston, 2 hours later, drove to the clerk's house and filed a lawsuit against the federal government. There was a law in the books back then, might still be in case, that the clerk had to stay open essentially 24 hours a day. So the case was docketed that night that Lyndon Johnson signed the law. That was the first case. And one of the things that Rolliston would contend in his legal arguments that rolled forth all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court was that he felt like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a violation of his 13th Amendment right. He was he was saying that the federal government is essentially enslaving him by telling him who he could or could not serve at his motel. The other lawsuit involved the Pickwick Restaurant, which Atlantans, I'm sure, are familiar from the history, which was built from the ground up and operated by Lester Maddox, who not long after these events would become governor of Georgia. And Maddox always had a busy restaurant, but he would never serve. He had black employees, as did Rolliston, but Maddox would never serve black customers. So the first night after, a Friday night, the first night after Lyndon Johnson signed the law, three ministry students decided to test the law at the Pickwick. And Maddox would repel them with a pistol, with axe handles he sold to his customers. Within days, those three ministry students, who were all students at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, the ITC, they would file a suit against Maddox. So you have these two legal cases going forth, and they were really sister cases. They were heard by the same three judges in federal court in Georgia, ultimately went up to the Supreme Court later on. So it's one of the reasons I found this really interesting that both cases were in Atlanta was, because Atlanta had a slogan back then that it was called the city too busy to hate. And Atlanta, of course, has been described as the black mecca for empowerment and local government. But in the early 1960s, when these events were happening, there was very much a racial disparity that was very clear still in Atlanta. There were two worlds. Taxi cabs would be segregated based on white customers or black customers. Shops and restaurants would choose to serve based on race. One of the people I talked with for the book was a woman named Paula Young Shelton, who was the daughter of Andrew Young, the future mayor of Atlanta, and she was terrific to talk to. But she recalled this incident before her dad was the mayor. When she was a very young child, the family went to a new Holiday Inn that had a new restaurant. And they looked at the fancy chandeliers and this really cool restaurant, and as Paula said, they wouldn't let us in. That was the Atlanta of the early 1960s. Atlanta, of course, has long had very prestigious black universities, strong black community home ownership. But still, in the early 60s, it was a world that was divided in many measures based on race. I think Jesse Jackson, I talked with him about these issues, really put it best. He described Atlanta as the centerpiece of joy and pain, that there was so much progress, but there were still two worlds going on. So I set out to tell this story and to talk about what really these unheralded heroes, these young ministry students who were disciples of Martin Luther King, what they went through to try to just get a seat at the table. A pretty basic request. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things they went through. But before I do, when I was writing the book, I was struck by Amanda Gorman's beautiful poem at the inauguration for Biden-Harris. In one passage of her poem, I'm going to read it very briefly, very brief, came to mind. It made me think of these ministers, these ministry students. And she wrote, and this is from The Hill We Climb, "When day comes, we step out of the shade, for there is always light. If only we're brave enough to see it. If only we're brave enough to be it." And I think what these ministry students and others in the civil rights movements underwent really took a great deal of bravery. And before I really get deep into the Atlanta story, I wanted to put this story not only in the context of what was happening in the city, but what was happening across the country, and particularly in the Deep South. And so, I mean, anyone who's looked at history and goes back maybe is not surprised, but as I revisited the events in the Deep South, particularly in the early 60s, it was horrific. We all know about Medgar Evers. The night after John F. Kennedy's speech to the nation saying, we need some basic civil rights legislation, Medgar Evers was shot dead in his back in his driveway by a white supremacist. In Mississippi, there was a small business owner who witnessed a state legislator shoot an NAACP leader and decided to tell the truth of what had happened. He was gunned down in his driveway, shot in the face. And in Florida, North Florida, when a hotel pool decided to integrate, or I should say the customers decided to integrate during this movement, when black and white customers jumped into the pool, the motel owner poured acid into the pool. Of course, there were the cases in Mississippi that we all know about. 2 young teens picked up by members of the KKK, beaten, and their mouths were taped shut, thrown into the water to suffocate. These are horrific events, and there are too many more to discuss. But this was the time when the ministry students went out and said, "We're gonna stand up for the Civil Rights Act of 1964." So they squared off, really. These ministry students at the ITC looked at 2 businesses in Atlanta that they knew were not integrating even after the Supreme Court ruling. One was, of course, the Heart of Atlanta. They knew this because the owner filed suit that night. The other one was the Pickerick, because everyone in town knew the Pickerick was whites only. And so they squared off against Morton Rolston and Lester Maddox. And Maddox, as I'm sure everyone here probably knows, was a fascinating figure in Georgia politics. For the backstory, he came from a family of 9, an impoverished family. He worked odd jobs from when he was a kid, 4 or 5 jobs at a time. One point, he would have his mom buy peanuts from a store, walk them home, boil them, then walk a mile and a half back and sell them for a 50-cent profit. So he sort of built himself from the bootstraps up. He dropped out of high school in the 10th grade simply to make money because his parents didn't really have any money. And so he built the Pickerick. He bought it on property that was at the time just north of Georgia Tech. Now it's property's part of Georgia Tech. And it was his place. It was his home away from home. It's where he ate most of his meals, where his family ate most of his meals. And he was going to damn well decide who came in and who didn't. Maddox, in his restaurant, he was an ardent segregationist. In his restaurant, he had a segregation wishing well where you could throw in nickels or dimes or quarters and wish for segregation. And he had political views sort of emanating from the success of his restaurant as he got more active in Atlanta. And this is probably no surprise to some folks here who know about this, but in the Atlanta papers every Saturday, he would take out an ad called Pickerick Says. That's the name of his restaurant. And it was like 4 inches across, 13 inches down, and the very bottom was the specials of the week. But the first 12 inches were all Maddox's views on what the government was trying to do and telling him how to run his business. He railed against the race mixers in Atlanta. He was not shy to speak his mind. And so when the Civil Rights Act of 1964 came out, he girded. Now, I should also mention that Maddox ran for mayor of Atlanta twice and lost both times. This is, of course, before he became governor. And he lost because the black vote in the city was entirely against him. Like 98 to 99% of the vote was entirely against him. He actually did fairly well with Atlanta's white community, but not with the black community. And Maddox would forever blame Martin Luther King. He called Martin Luther King, this may sound familiar, an enemy of the country. So, and then when Maddox saw the Civil Rights Act coming, he girded for trouble. I want to read, my second passage is about the young ministry students who decided that they were going to go try to get a piece of chicken or a piece of fish at Lester Maddox's Pickerick restaurant. And now, one day after Lyndon Johnson signed the nation's most far-reaching civil rights law, Maddox braced for more visitors. Black voters had sent him, I'm sorry, I misjumped. Save that for later. It was a good opening, I know. Let me read this one first, I apologize. We'll get there. This is setting up as the ministry students were getting ready to go out and see Maddox. In many respects, the young minister personified Lester Maddox's deepest fears. Disciples of the Reverend King Jr., they, like their mentor, dressed formally when they conducted the affairs of civil rights, donning suits and sport jackets. And like King, they viewed the fight for equality in a religious framework. Black voters had single-handedly destroyed Maddox's 2 bids to become mayor, and the failed candidate blamed King and his followers for those losses. The ministry students then represented King's flock to Maddox, and they ready to press against the one principle he held most dear, the right to operate his private affairs any way he wanted. Maddox would never let black people eat at his restaurant. He'd fight like hell before he allowed civil rights agitators close to Martin Luther King to integrate his business. Now, a little backstory on the ministry students. These were all students of the ITC, as I'd mentioned, who sort of flocked together, and they all would go on to become activist preachers in their own communities in Texas, in Georgia, in South Carolina, in Chicago. Their names were Albert Dunn, Woodrow Lewis, Albert Sampson, Charles Wells, and George Willis III. And as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, they took it to heart that it was their mission to go out and make sure that everyone had a seat at the table, black, white, Hispanic, otherwise. But they also were disciples of the Reverend King's preaching of nonviolent social justice, which means you go out and you make your stand that you're trying to make. But if others are aggressive towards you, you're not going to be aggressive toward them. That was the whole preaching. Not everyone in the civil rights movement agreed with King's preaching. Some people thought that wasn't the way to go, but King certainly believed it. And these 5 unheralded heroes of the civil rights movement, 5 of many, certainly believed it. So so now I'm getting back to the passage I started to read, which you've got a sneak preview on. Okay, and now one day after Lyndon Johnson signed the nation's most far-reaching civil rights law, Maddox braced for more visitors. He had repelled black customers before. Black voters had sent him to vote 2 lost at the polls. He'd summoned all of his inner fire to ensure they didn't conquer him now. As Willis pulled close, Dunn stepped from the car, eager as always to confront his adversaries. Yet as Willis began to park, a crowd led by Lester Maddox rushed to the car, and Maddox himself tried to slam the driver door shut so Willis couldn't exit. Willis tried again and again to open the door, but Maddox pushed back each time he did. Then he pulled a pistol and aimed it toward Willis's face, holding it there and ordering the young activist to leave. He pointed it toward my face and told me to get off his property or he'd kill me, Willis wrote in his senior ITC essay. All the while, Woodrow Lewis remained in the back seat, encircled by the mass surrounding the car. As he witnessed Maddox stick a gun to Willis's face, Lewis was so shaken he was left speechless. In the back seat alone, he said a silent prayer for himself and his colleagues. I was so shocked and stunned, he said, no words could come out. And that was the first of what would be 4 visits that these ministers took. There were 5 of them. They didn't all go at the same time. First of the 4 trips they would take to try to get service at Lester Maddox's Pickard restaurant. Now, their visits to the Heart of Atlanta were not, I would say, were not as dramatic as the visits to the Pickard restaurant. The Heart of Atlanta I had mentioned was run by Morton Rolston, Emory-trained lawyer, and businessman who always dressed in a coat and tie, his hair slicked back. Whenever he spoke, he seemed like he was in a courtroom. He was very formal, but he, like Maddox, was very much against integration. And he, like Maddox, was against the government telling him as a private businessman how to do his affairs. Thus, he filed his lawsuit that very night. Morton Rolston, did not sell axe handles to his customers like Lester Maddox did, but one time he did have a flare gun pistol that he pulled out when black customers tried to enter his motel. One of those customers was the late, great John Lewis. So he had repelled potential integrators before. And so a couple of the ministry students from the ITC, as they had done at the Pickerick, they tried to get a bed at the Heart of Atlanta Motel. One of them was a minister named Albert Sampson, who began his studies at the ITC, but then left to go work for the NAACP. And Sampson tried to sort of outsmart the motel. He was out of town one day, and he called him and said, I want to book a room for tomorrow. He wired $12.63, I think it was, by Western Union to pay his bill. So when he comes up the next day to get his motel room, the clerk at the front desk suddenly can't find his reservation. And Sampson says, well, there it is, it's right there. There's my name, Albert Sampson. And the clerk kind of fumbles, and then Morton Rolston comes out, leads Maddox away, and Rolston said, you know, I've got a suit against the government. I'm not going to allow any black clientele until the suit is resolved. And then a couple of days later, one of the other ministers, Charles Wells, one of the ministry students, Charles Wells, came to the motel, and he, like Albert Sampson, tried to get a room, and Maddox wouldn't have it. Maddox wouldn't take it. Those visits were extremely consequential because while others, like John Lewis and some others, had tried to integrate the Heart of Atlanta, that was before the Civil Rights Act of '64. So really, Rolston or other proprietors were empowered. They could kick him out. In fact, John Lewis was arrested. He was one of 29 people arrested for the terrible crime of trying to get food service. But now, since the law was flipped upside down, so now Rolston was the one flouting the law. And so their visits proved really consequential. And as the cases, the Pickerick and the Heart of Atlanta cases, traveled through federal court in Georgia and ultimately the Supreme Court, they were the key witnesses. There was a crucial court hearing in July of '64 where the government's only two witnesses, Bobby Kennedy's team's only two witnesses were Albert Sampson and Charles Wells. And I'm going to read the next passage. I'm going to find the right one this time. So bear with me. And of course, the case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. Without naming them, the Supreme Court jurists, were referring to the ITC's Charles Wells and the NAACP's Albert Sampson, who had been turned away from the Heart of Atlanta days after Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. Even as their attempts to book rooms enhanced the federal government's case against Rolston, and as their courtroom testimony helped Robert Kennedy's lawyers secure victories in the Georgia federal courts and now the U.S. Supreme Court, Wells and Sampson's roles receded to the background. They were the unseen foot soldiers, the grunts on the front lines in this civil rights engagement. And I think these ministers really were. I should mention, one of the ministers, George Willis, was an amateur boxer who was pretty skilled in the ring but never lifted his glove, so to speak, when he was turned away. So ultimately, the ministry students and many, many others pushing for equality in Atlanta and beyond, they were just five, as we all know, of thousands. They ultimately found some victory in the U.S. Supreme Court. They found victory in federal court before that. But the victory did not come easily by any stretch. That's why I kept thinking back to the Amanda Gorman poem. As they went back to the Pickerick, they attempted to go back to the Pickerick a second time, a third time, a fourth time, while Morton Rolston, the proprietor of the Heart of Atlanta, had said, once the courts officially rule, I'll follow suit. And after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled, he did that. His son, who I interviewed, worked part-time in the motel in early 1965 and told me after the Supreme Court ruling, Heart of Atlanta became integrated. It was, as his son said, it was a victory for civil rights. But Maddox was not willing to accept this as a victory for civil rights. He refused to allow not only black customers, but anyone who he viewed as an integrationist. He would go table to table and said, are you with the ACLU? Are you an integrationist? And he found out they were. He kicked them out just as he did with these ministers. But the courts kept telling Maddox, you lose, you're in contempt of court. So what Maddox did was, after he lost every court battle, he closed his restaurant for a month, closed the Pickerick for a month, and then reopened it, and he called it the Lester Maddox Cafeteria. Same restaurant on the same grounds, 5 blocks north of Georgia Tech. Same menu, same workers, same everything, same telephone. But he had a couple of new rules for entry. And those rules were he would not serve anyone who was an integrationist, or he would not serve anyone who came from out of state. That was relevant because when the Civil Rights Act of '64 was passed, Congress passed it saying, it used the Commerce Clause, saying that if you're a private business, ostensibly private business, but you expect customers from out of state, you fall under the Commerce Clause and you cannot then bar customers based on race. So Maddox was saying, I'm not subject to the Commerce Clause, I'm not subject to the rules of the government. And ultimately, the ministry students would persevere, but I think it was in some ways a complex victory for everyone involved. You know, Maddox, like Rolston, lost every single court hearing, every single court ruling went against them. And then Maddox ultimately would shut down his restaurant rather than pay a $200 a day fine and serve black customers. He ultimately shut it down. But one of his friends told him during this whole fight, he said, Lester, this thing is going to make you governor. And so while Maddox lost his both bids for mayor in Atlanta, as everyone I'm sure here probably knows, he later on, just maybe a year and a half after these events, became governor of Georgia. He found support in many pockets of the state that were maybe not as progressive as Atlanta. He didn't ultimately get the majority of the vote, but there were so many votes for a write-in candidate that Maddox and the Republican candidate, neither of them got 50%. The state legislature at the time was Democrat-laden, so they put Maddox in office as the governor. This is a quick footnote. His term as a governor, I think, was surprising to a lot of people. It surprised the ministers a little bit. Maddox hired black workers into government posts. He looked to clean up the state prison system. And he was also really open and into second chances for inmates who sort of admitted their sins and who, like him, had sort of a deep religious framework. So he was surprising in some ways, but he wasn't perhaps surprising in other ways. He would remain a segregationist until his last breath. He forever hated Martin Luther King, so much so that Martin Luther King, when he was killed, was while Maddox was the governor of Georgia in Atlanta, and the funeral was, of course, in Atlanta. Maddox not only would he refused to attend the funeral, he had armed guards stationed outside the State House and inside the State House expecting sort of a riot to ensue. It was really a day that tarnished his legacy, just as these moments at the Pickerick did as well. So he had a complex history as the governor. But I'm going to read one last passage, and then I'm happy to open up to any and all questions that you guys have. And this last passage occurs in January of 1965. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the Heart of Atlanta case in December of 1964, so we're a month out, and Lester Maddox was still refusing, even after the Supreme Court ruled, still refusing to serve black customers. And on this day, 4 of the ministry students turned out to try to get service at his restaurant. Maddox rushed to the men, shoving them over and over away from the front steps and toward the sidewalk. It was as if Maddox were sickened by the thought of any of the men actually crossing through the threshold of his restaurant's front door, and he pushed back as if his life depended upon it. Maddox would indeed later say his life, liberty, and freedoms stood at the precipice as the young ministers again pressed for a plate of food. He reached for their necks and sport coats and top hats. At one point, Maddox wielded axe handles in both hands as he stormed toward his visitors. He pushed and swiped so hard he had to catch his breath a moment. Then, as the ministers held their ground and began walking again toward the front door, he pushed and shoved some more. All the while, Atlanta police officers passed by on motorbikes or on foot, never stopping Lester Maddox's newest physical attack on the nation's integration movement. A soundless 4-minute, 37-second black and white video captures the stunning scene. The archives preserved at the Civil Rights Digital Library identify just one of the 4 men, the Reverend Charles Wells. The other 3 are not named. I sat down with one of them, Woodrow Lewis of South Carolina. Sitting at his dining table one morning in 2019, Lewis viewed the footage for the first time. Until I clicked on the grainy newsreel video, he had no idea it existed. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ronnie. And now we will take your questions. I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but we are live streaming this evening, so we have a few folks watching from home. So to make sure they can hear your question, we'll need you to ask it in the microphone. So I'm happy to come to you. Absolutely, sir.
Thank you for your presentation. Two quick questions. What drew you to write this book? You know, everyone has, if my father was an astronaut, I'm interested in space. Okay. If my father was a policeman, I'm interested in law enforcement. And then the second question is the 5 students, were they members of any church, or were they just attending ITC? Were they members of some Baptist or Protestant church?
Sure. Thank you. Two really good questions. Thank you. Yeah, when you never know where an idea is going to come from. And for me, this idea actually spawned from going to the movie theater one day with my wife, who's there in the second row. Went to see a really terrific movie called Loving, about Richard and Mildred Loving. In their case, they were a black and white couple in Virginia. They were jailed because they were an interracial couple. In their case, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and of course became the Loving Supreme Court ruling, which is one of the foremost civil rights rulings under the Supreme Court. I thought it was such a beautifully told movie, and I left that theater thinking, damn, I wish I wrote that story. I wish that was my book that became this movie, because it touched upon civil rights, which I've always been interested in as a journalist, but it also told the backstory of this couple who were so unassuming, they apparently didn't even go to the U.S. Supreme Court while their lawyers argued their case. They stayed back home in Virginia. And so I thought to myself, here's a question. Is there a civil rights Supreme Court ruling that's deeply consequential that maybe has been lost to history? So that set me on a path to find that. And I found Heart of Atlanta, and I think it does qualify. Again, Atlanta and perhaps Georgia aside, I do think this case has been slipped through the cracks. It's rarely mentioned among the foremost civil rights rulings by the U.S. Supreme Court. We have the great museum in D.C., the African American History Museum. It's not there. Maddox's axe handle is there, but the Heart of Atlanta case is not there. So I thought it was important to tell that. So the ministry students were all studying for their Masters of Divinity at the ITC. So they could become fully ordained ministers. And all of them then became ministers in their local churches and communities and continued their social activism for many, many decades in Georgia, in South Carolina, in Texas, in Chicago. Of the 5 main ministry students who were involved, 2 are still alive, and I had really the honor of connecting with them. And I'll never forget my first phone calls with each of them. They were taken aback. The Reverend Sampson, who's in Chicago, he's good friends with Jesse Jackson. He told me, "You brought tears to my eyes. I've been waiting for this call all my life." As a journalist, that sort of makes a pretty good day for you when you get that kind of response. And Woodrow Lewis in South Carolina, and I also spoke with the widow of the lead plaintiff, George Willis, and these they were then ministry students. Sort of their role, I think, has been lost to history, and they were all very enthused to have this story told, and I'm deeply grateful for all the time they gave me and all the memories they shared with me.
I agree. Thank you very much for this wonderful story. Could you remind us of who the Supreme Court justices were who made that decision? Was it unanimous or divided? And just a little bit about the opinion and what happened sort of subsequent to that decision. Thank you.
Yeah, no, really on-point question. So this was under the Warren Court, Earl Warren, and he was Chief Justice for 16 years, during which the U.S. Supreme Court issued some of its, I think you could say, its most momentous social justice and civil rights rulings. Heart of Atlanta, one of them, which I'm trying to bring to light. The Loving case, Brown v. Board of Education, the Gideon case as well. So all the Miranda warning case, all of the Gideon case said that criminal suspects have to be told their rights and they have a right to a lawyer. All those rulings came under the Warren Court. So it was really a consequential time for U.S. history. And the ruling in the Heart of Atlanta case was 9-0. And, I've talked to some legal scholars about this case. They feel like it was really consequential. If you think about it, in the early 60s, the sit-in movement, the Greensboro 4 movement, was so consequential, so in the news. But one of the scholars I talked to said, actually a couple of them said, this ruling was so clear and concise and was the unanimous ruling, the success of the ruling may be part of its invisibility. You think of Brown v. Board of Education, there's still struggles over school busing, right? But you don't hear struggles about restaurants and motels turning away customers based on race. So that answers your question. Thank you.
I grew up in the South. Thank you for reminding me of the impeach Earl Warren signs that I used to see all over the place. My question is about the media response to what was happening at Pickwick and at the hotel, particularly the two newspapers, since this was a time when they, I think, had a whole lot more influence than they have now.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I went back and read as many of the stories I could, and I thank the Atlanta History Center. I found some of the old archives that are hard to find online here. So I, again, thank the History Center for its great information I had. There were a lot of times where there were stories about those battles between Maddox and the ministers, where Maddox was the only one quoted in the Atlanta newspapers. And there was this photo I found in the Atlanta Journal in August of 1964, when a couple of ministry students tried to go to the Pickwick, and Maddox forcibly is shoving away one of them, and the ministry student was not named in the paper. And I found it's George Willis, one of the people I wrote about. So there was that last snippet I read about when the ministry students tried to go in January of 65, there was a brief article in the Atlanta Journal that didn't mention the ministry students. It only quoted Maddox as saying that they tried to rush in to the building and I sort of blocked them. It really didn't have the full story. So I would say, I'm sure they had some thorough coverage for sure, but some of the stories did not have the full picture of what was going on for sure. And then maybe that helps explain why the ministry students sort of were not, back then and certainly now, are not household names. They were often unnamed, unmentioned.
One of the things that stood out to me from the story was how quickly things progressed from the attempts to integrate the restaurant to the litigation to a decision to the Supreme Court. I know sometimes in these stories what gets overlooked is how strategic this was. Was there anything, a plan in place that this was always going to be part of litigation? Sort of how ready was that to go from the moment from when they started? Because it all progressed very quickly. Well,
it did. Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, progressed quickly in the courts for sure, especially with the way cases go today. But it took forever to get to this point, right? When John Kennedy won the White House, he promised that new civil rights legislation would be part of his first package of reforms, but it took a couple of years to even get there. And of course, we're talking decades before that. But I think what happened was that the Warren Court had a huge appetite to weigh in on this. So when these two cases were filed, I know I have a number of lawyers in the room, so I'm being very careful. I got my legal technology right on point, baby. So when these two legal cases were filed, Rolston against the U.S. government, and then the three ministry students against Maddox and his Pickwick restaurant, they both went to a three-panel court of judges in federal court in the Northern District of Georgia. In they heard the cases simultaneously. While there were two cases, they heard them one after the other, and they issued their ruling simultaneously. So they really were sister cases. And when they issued their first ruling, the federal court issued its first ruling, shooting down Maddox, shooting down Rolston, both of them appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court in a preliminary appeal heard by Hugo Black. And when Black, again, shot both of them down in a ruling that had both cases in one ruling, he made clear he wanted the full court to hear it. So there was great momentum. And actually, the U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments in this case on the first week of their session, which is normally sort of an administrative matter. So the U.S. Supreme Court had an appetite to hear this, which explains how Civil Rights Act passed in July of 64, the U.S. Supreme Court rules in December of 64. That's record-setting turnaround.
One, two, and three. You go over there first.
Hi, I was shocked by just the use of scripture on both sides. And I just kind of wanted to know more of your thoughts, or even in some of the interviews, what was said about, I guess, the biblical tension that was there.
Yeah, no, for the ministers, they very much came to this from a deeply religious framework, and Reverend Sampson, who's still in Chicago fighting the good fight, he said he felt comfortable, like he was comfortable with the fact that he might die. And he made that pact with himself. So he knew he was on a righteous cause. He knew that he was on a righteous cause with the law. He knew that he was on a righteous cause religiously on all fronts. So I think the religion certainly drove them. And I think, for the ministry students, being leading members of their local community churches, for them, social justice activism goes hand in hand with religion, and it drove them. It was very much a fabric of what they did, everything that they did. I don't know that I can speak so much for Maddox and for Rolston, but I know Maddox was also very deeply religious. There's no question about that. He cited biblical scripture many times in talking about his actions. As if you read the book, you saw that. So, religion is such a deeply personal thing. I think we give everyone their space to find sort of their own personal religion, but it was clearly a factor I agree with you, on both sides of the equation here. And I really tried to, portray that as the ministry students went out and sort of preached the social justice that they wanted to preach.
Thank you for this evening, and I have not read your book, but I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you.
And it sounds like you might have already touched on this, and not to drill too far in, but in your research, what was the response of the greater religious community of Atlanta? So, what were the different communities saying? Did you come across any of that? And my second question is, was there any sort of outlier that surprised you in any way that you weren't anticipating and seeing as you researched this matter?
Sure. Well, speaking about Maddox and Rolston, I think I'm trying to answer your first question this way. They both very strongly said, I'm a private business person. You're invading my liberty. You're invading my right to choose what I want to do. And so not only in Georgia, but Atlanta, they certainly had a lot of friends, some in in religious communities, many in the business community. There was, Atlanta during this time was going through a struggle where ultimately the city was lurching forward to, much stronger racial equality, but it wasn't an easy victory. I mentioned the Paula Young Shelton being turned away with her dad. During the tension in Atlanta during this time, where there were mass arrests, there was some violence. I think it was the Atlanta Restaurant Association took out an ad saying, we don't favor forced integration. So there was pushback for sure within the larger Atlanta community. It wasn't a slam dunk on either side. And tell me of the surprises. Yeah. Maybe it shouldn't surprise me, but as I went back and looked back at these events in the early 60s, both in Atlanta and across the country, I have to be honest, I was surprised by revisiting so many cases of racial violence and racial hatred and just the horrors, burying a couple of teenagers in the water, burying 3 young civil rights workers under an earthen dam. Shooting someone in the back, and just for of course, Bull Connor, with his fire hoses and children. We're all aware of those, but I went back and looked one after the other, after the other, after the other, after the other. It did sort of hit me a little bit about really how it took immense bravery for anyone to say, we deserve equality, because you're going to potentially face, significant pushback or even more. As Reverend Sampson said, I thought I might die. Sampson, one of the times he turned out that a Pickwick, Maddox also had a pistol, but he also had a barrel of axe handles nearby. And Sampson said, I will never forget the barrel of axe handles. So those things kind of took me back a little bit.
This is just anecdotal, but in the 70s, Maddox had opened up a Pickwick restaurant on Roswell Road, because I'd gone there, and it was pretty mediocre, so it didn't last long, but I didn't know if you knew about that.
I focused mostly on the 60s and looked a little bit at what he did afterwards, and then he ran for governor again and ran for president at one point. And I know he had the business open for a little while after that, yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with Kevin Cruz's book, White Flight.
Yes.
He makes the argument that the rise of the libertarian movement in the Republican, it was in part a response to the civil rights movement and the White Flight. But in your presentation of these two cases, it appears to me that a libertarian understanding of the government's role in business was a precursor to that. And I was kind of wondered whether you had thoughts about whether that libertarian arm was part of something beforehand. I think that seems to me that's part of the response in Bob Jones and some of the other organizing. So I just kind of wondered where you thought libertarian response was into civil rights.
Yeah, I did read Kevin Cruz's book as part of the research for this, and he did an excellent job. A very, thoughtful book, thought-provoking, and did a lot of good research too. A shout out to, I don't know him, but a shout out to Kevin Cruz. But I think it was a precursor. I mean, for Maddox in particular, you look at his background, just the fact that someone who was a 10th grade dropout became the governor of the state is pretty stunning. And so his journey is sort of a fascinating journey along the way. And I do think that part and parcel of his response here was that, he was an ardent segregationist, but he also built everything by hand, and he felt the government's not going to tell me how to do anything. So I think that was a precursor that before these events. So then when the government started going about the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Supreme Court weighed in, he thought Earl Warren was a bum, so he had those views were already framed, I think, before these events, and they catapulted once this became reality.
Any others? Oh, yes.
I had two questions. It sounded like that conversation you had with Morrilton's son, who actually was worked at the hotel himself, but in the driveway, and he became the pilot for later on. But I'm curious, the perspective of someone who was there at the time, on the other side of the question. If there was something that you thought was, that didn't actually fit, but you thought was really, really fascinating, that now looking back and what they might have to say. And the second thing I had to do was, it seemed like it was interesting to me that Martin Luther King didn't really want them to do this. He didn't want to take on Maddox.
It was his dad.
And so it was just an interesting thing about if you actually dug into exactly, why he was so, they were several miles apart from the Ebenezer Church. It's this might have been the thing to do, but yet he didn't want to take on this guy. And so those are the two questions I had.
You can tell Barry read the book, so he's ahead of you guys. So a couple of things. I interviewed both sons of Mr. Rolston and Lester Maddox, and both of them honestly said the same thing, that they felt their father's fight against this movement and the ministers was not about the men, it was about the government telling them what to do. Their quotes were literally the same thing. I interviewed both of them sort of in their front yards. And Rolston said, he said, it was a sign of the times. Back then, when my dad was operating the business, it was a world where motels and restaurants would be black only or white only, and my dad was part of that. He felt like his dad treated his black employees with decency. But he also said, I thought was revealing that, he was a clerk at the front desk, that when buses of black church groups would come and say at the Heart of Atlanta, he considered it a victory for civil rights. I don't think his dad ever viewed it as a victory for civil rights, so there was a disparate path there. And as far as Martin Luther King, it was actually when these young ministers were plotting to go out and to try to dine at the Pickerick, it was Martin Luther King's father told one of the ministers, maybe the most aggressive of them, Albert Dunn, he said, don't do it. All you're going to do is bring more attention to Maddox and his stance. And Dunn said, no, we're doing it. So he went out.
Anyone else? Going once? Great. Well, I want to ask one more question to wrap us up this evening, Ronnie, and then don't forget, if you haven't purchased your book, they're available for purchase, and Ronnie will be signing books afterwards as well. So please take advantage of that. But you were writing this book at a very interesting time, right? And researching this book at a very interesting time to be talking about race relations, civil rights, Supreme Court cases, everything else. You visited us, in August of 2020, so just a couple of months after the events in Minneapolis with George Floyd. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about have you felt that focus brought some renewed attention on maybe the undertold aspects of the civil rights movement, and how writing this book informed, because you write books, but you also are a reporter, of course. So how that kind of informed some of your reporting and investigative reporting during that?
No, that's a deeply on point question. So I met with the two surviving ministers in 2019 before COVID, when you can travel the world freely, and then afterwards. I talked with them many, many times each. And one time, I was calling Reverend Sampson in Chicago to ask him some follow-up questions, and it was 2 days after George Floyd. And he opened it by saying, "Why am I crying here all the way in Chicago? We're in 2020." So I thought about the parallels between the racial struggles of 1960s and the racial struggles of 2020. And Kay Willis, who's the widow of George Willis, the boxer who wouldn't lift his hands to fight when he tried to integrate, she said the same thing. She said the 1960s were, a really troubling, hard time for civil rights, but it was, again, she felt, under Trump. And you look at all the parallels. I don't want to take the liberty parallel too far, but that was the argument that Rolston and Maddox made. And, supporters of the former president, many of them, not all clearly, but some supporters of the former president who didn't want to get vaccinated, they wore masks, they would cite that. Who's the government to tell me what to do? There's a parallel there. Of course, because of the racial violence with George Floyd's killing, there was the March on Washington of 2020, just like there was the March on Washington of 1963. And so I kept seeing so many parallels. And I also thought, not to get too far afield here, but, basically, Black Atlanta is the reason that Lester Maddox never became mayor of the city. You look at the vote in the 2020 presidential race, Biden-Harris won this area by a huge amount. So there were some parallels I thought about time and time again while thinking about this. But for sure, and I was writing these pages during Black Lives Matter. So I get to that in sort of the epilogue. I get to some of these events, but while the whole book is about the 60s, it certainly informed my writing, and it was with me. You couldn't help but be with you, the racial struggle of today. And, the Civil Rights Act of 64, it was deeply monumental. But as the Library of Congress said in a write-up years ago, a law alone is not going to change people's activities. It's going to be, civil rights and equality is going to be decided by struggles in the street. And that was a prescient comment that remains true today.
Thank you again for coming back to Atlanta History Center.
Oh, sure.
Please help me thank Ronnie for his wonderful. Thank you. And we will meet all of you in the lobby so you can get your books signed. Thanks again to all of you for being here, for being such a great audience and asking such wonderful questions. If you enjoyed tonight's presentation, there are QR codes on the bookmarks in your books that take you to future events that we have. We hope you'll join us again. In particular, we'll be welcoming longtime Atlanta journalist Cynthia Tucker here for her new book, The Southernization of America, which is just fabulous. So she'll be at the end of April. So we hope to see you there. Thanks, everyone.